The education system told you that Europeans arrived on an empty continent with no history. That version worked for centuries, but the facts tell a different story. The Incas performed skull surgery with an 80% survival rate. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already practicing representative democracy before the Founding Fathers were born. Women voted in indigenous councils centuries before the 19th Amendment. Discover 25 facts your school never mentioned. Number 1. They had anesthesia before Europe. While European surgeons had the patient bite down on a piece of leather and hope they passed out from the pain, Native American healers were already using plants like coca, datura, and willow bark to block pain during real surgeries. And these weren't simple procedures. Peoples like the Incas were performing cranial trepanations, literally opening the skull of a living person, more than 2,000 years ago. What's most impressive is that skulls found by archaeologists show clear signs of healing, which means the patients survived and lived for years after the operation. Some studies point to survival rates above 80%. In medieval Europe, that same procedure killed most patients. Indigenous medicine wasn't primitive. It was advanced in a way the Western world took centuries to reach. Number 2. Wall Street was born on a native route. Before it became the financial center of the world, that stretch of Manhattan was already busy. The Lenape, a people who had lived in the region for thousands of years, kept a trail there used for trade and travel between different villages. When the Dutch arrived in the 17th century, they didn't cut a new path. They simply followed what was already there. The wall that gave the street its name was built by the colonists in 1653 as a defensive barrier, but the route itself had been well worn long before that. The interesting thing is that the Lenape called the island Mannahatta, which means something like land of hills. They knew every trail, every waterway. Europeans took advantage of that knowledge and then erased its origins. Today, millions pass through Wall Street every day without knowing they're walking on a path native people laid out centuries before the first penny was ever traded there. Number 3. When Europeans arrived, they looked at wampum and thought it was just decoration. They were wrong. Those beads made from shells worked like real money, with clear rules. Color set the value. Purple beads were worth twice as much as white ones. There was even counterfeiting, which shows the system was taken seriously. But wampum went beyond currency. It served as a contract between nations, a record of agreements, and a historical memory of important events. The Dutch were the first to realize how powerful that was. And what did they do? They produced wampum on an industrial scale, using European tools to flood the market and drive down its value. It worked. Native people watched their economy collapse without a single shot being fired. This was probably the first economic warfare attack on the American continent. Number 4. Long before modern hospitals had the technique down, native midwives were already performing C-sections successfully. In Uganda, in 1879, a British doctor witnessed a healer open a mother's abdomen, remove the baby alive, and close the incision precisely using thorns and an herbal paste. Mother and child survived. On the Great Plains of North America, tribes also had their own surgical methods for difficult births. The shocking detail is this: at the same time, European hospitals had extremely high death rates for this procedure. Infections killed most women operated on by trained surgeons. Meanwhile, indigenous healers, without modern anesthesia or sterilized operating rooms, were getting results that Western doctors took decades to achieve consistently. Number 5. Long before Europeans set foot on the continent, the Incas already had a message delivery service that worked better than anything in the Old World at the same time. They called the messengers Chasqui. Runners trained from a young age, who were stationed at relay posts spread across more than 40,000 kilometers of paved roads. A Chasqui would run to the next station, hand the message off to another runner, and so on, day and night, without stopping. A piece of information could cross the entire empire in just 3 days. To give you an idea, the Roman Empire, at the height of its power, couldn't set up anything this efficient on a continental scale. And here's the detail most people don't know. The Incas did all of this without horses and without wheels. It was pure human ability and organization. Number 6. Between 1970 and 1976, the Indian Health Service, the federal agency responsible for Native people's health care, carried out mass sterilizations on American Indian women. Estimates say that between 25% and 50% of Native women of childbearing age were sterilized during that period. Many of them were teenagers. Several signed consent forms written in medical language they couldn't understand, and some were pressured while they were in labor. In 1996, the General Accounting Office investigated just 4 states and already found more than 3,400 confirmed cases. The real number is probably much higher, because most reservations weren't even included in the investigation. This didn't happen in the distant past. It happened at the same time that humans had already been to the moon, and Americans were watching All in the Family on TV. Number 7. Before Europeans arrived, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already running a trade network that stretched from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. We're talking thousands of kilometers of routes where furs, corn, tobacco, and wampum moved around, with wampum working as currency. This economy wasn't thrown together. It had rules, agreements between nations, and established trading hubs that had been around for generations. What's most impressive is that historians estimate the amount of wealth moved by some of these nations rivaled that of small European colonies at the same time. While colonists still depended on supplies shipped in by boat, the Haudenosaunee had a self-sufficient, diverse economy that had been running for centuries. When the French and English arrived to trade for furs, they weren't teaching anyone how to do business. They were stepping into a market that had existed long before them. Number 8. In the 1870s, there were around 30 million buffalo on the Great Plains. In less than 2 decades, fewer than 1,000 were left. And that didn't happen by accident. General Philip Sheridan even told Congress that buffalo hunters had done more to control Native people than the entire army put together. The plan was simple and brutal. Without buffalo, Plains peoples like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche would lose their main source of food, shelter, and clothing. Unable to support themselves, they'd be forced to accept the reservations. White hunters killed whole herds and left the carcasses rotting out on the prairie, taking only the hides. The government not only allowed it, but funded it. Tribes that for generations had lived free by following the herds were pushed into hunger and dependence. It was one of the most calculated strategies in American history. Number 9. Until 1978, Native children could be taken from their families without their parents having any right to stop it. Social workers would show up on reservations and simply take the children away. The government treated indigenous homes as unfit by default. It's estimated that between 25% and 35% of all Native children were removed and placed with white families or in institutions. It wasn't hidden. It was official policy, and they called it voluntary assimilation. Many of those children never saw their parents again. Only in 1908, with the Indian Child Welfare Act, did tribes start to have a say in decisions about their own children. That means that even around the time of disco and Star Wars, the government was still separating Native families as a routine thing. Most Americans have never even heard about this. Number 10. Between the 1940s and 1950s, something disturbing happened at boarding schools for Native American children. The federal government authorized nutrition experiments that used these children as test subjects. Researchers deliberately cut food for entire groups to study the effects of malnutrition on the human body. Children who were already hungry were given even less food, all in the name of science. Some were given experimental supplements, others got nothing, just to compare results. No one asked the parents for permission. No one informed the families. These experiments stayed buried in classified files for decades until Canadian and American researchers brought it all to light in the 2000s. The hardest part to swallow is that the children were already in the government's forced custody, far from home. And even so, they were treated like disposable lab material. Number 11. 5 years before they took up arms in the famous Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Pueblo people had already tried another route. In 1605, Pueblo workers who were forced to serve in Spanish missions and farms in New Mexico simply stopped. It wasn't an isolated act. It was a coordinated refusal across several communities. They refused to farm, build, and keep the system that exploited them running. The Spanish responded with arrests and whippings, which only fueled the revolt that would come later. What stands out is that this happened more than 100 years before any recorded strike in the United States. Even so, almost no American labor history book mentions the Pueblo as pioneers of this kind of organized resistance. When people talk about the labor movement in this country, it usually starts back in the 19th century. But the truth is, the first documented collective work stoppage in the Americas was indigenous. Number 12. The Olmecs were already making tough rubber thousands of years before Charles Goodyear patented vulcanization in 1839. They mixed tree latex with the juice of a plant called morning glory, and the result was a material that was stretchy and waterproof. With that rubber, they made balls for ceremonial games, sandals that could handle rain, and containers that didn't let water through. Researchers at MIT tested the ancient recipe and confirmed that the process really worked. The ratio of ingredients changed the outcome. More juice made the rubber flexible. Less juice made it firm. In other words, these peoples weren't just messing around. They had applied chemistry down at least 3,500 years ago. Goodyear got the credit, but the technique already existed in the Americas long before Europe even knew what latex was. Number 13. Before the Founding Fathers met in Philadelphia, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already governing 5 native nations with a system that today we'd call representative democracy. The name of their code was Guyana-Shagoa, the Great Law of Peace. And what was in that document? Separation of powers among councils, a process for removing leaders from office, voting rights for women, and protections for individuals against government abuse. Researchers estimate that parts of this law already existed between 1450 and 1600. The U.S. Constitution was only drafted in 1787. In 1988, the U.S. Congress itself passed a resolution recognizing the influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on the formation of the American government. So when we talk about democracy on the American continent, the story starts way earlier than most people imagine. Number 14. Think about this situation. Your family has lived in a place for thousands of years. Then outsiders show up, take everything, create a new country, and then say, you need permission to be a citizen of that very place. That's exactly what happened to Native Americans. The Indian Citizenship Act was only signed in 1924, more than 150 years after the founding of the United States. But the story doesn't stop there. Even with the federal law, states like Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah kept blocking Native people at the ballot box for decades. They used literacy tests and poll taxes to keep them away from elections. Arizona only allowed indigenous voting in 1948. In other words, when Native veterans came home from World War II after fighting for the country, many still couldn't vote in the very state where they were born. They bled for the American flag before it recognized them. Number 15. In American schools, we learned that about 4,000 Cherokee died during the forced removal of 1838. That number stayed in textbooks for decades without anyone questioning it. But researchers who dug into missionaries' records, military reports, and tribal censuses came to a very different result. Between 8,000 and 10,000 deaths, more than double. And it wasn't just the Cherokee. The Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw went through the same path. Many died from hunger, cold, and disease before they even crossed the Mississippi. The government knew about the conditions and went ahead anyway. The smaller numbers weren't a mistake, they were a choice. It was easier to tell a story with fewer dead than to explain why so many were sacrificed for land that already had an owner. Number 16. Between 1670 and 1720, English colonizers captured and enslaved between 30,000 and 50,000 Native Americans just in the southern part of what is now the United States. To put it in perspective, that number was similar to the number of enslaved Africans in the same region during the same period. The difference is that almost no one talks about it. Entire tribes were broken apart through wars deliberately stirred up by colonists who armed one group against another specifically to create prisoners and sell them as slaves. Many of these native people were sent to plantations in the Caribbean and never came back. Over time, that history got pushed aside in books, almost as if it never happened. But it did, and on a scale that completely changes what most of us learned about this chapter of the country. Number 17. This wasn't something done by outlaws or some out-of-control militia. It was public policy with set prices and receipts. In 1755, Massachusetts offered 40 pounds for the scalp of a native man and 20 for the scalp of a woman or child. Pennsylvania did the same. Hunters turned in scalps at official posts and got paid like they were collecting for a service done for the state. These orders are still in public archives today. Anyone can look them up. The most disturbing part is that it went on for decades and across generations. It wasn't a one-off episode. It was a system set up to encourage the extermination of entire populations, and it worked exactly as planned. When someone says the decline of Native Americans was just a consequence of disease and conflict, these laws tell a very different story. Number 18. Long before any Europeans set foot on the continent, the Hohokam had already solved one of engineering's biggest problems: getting water across the desert. In Arizona, they built more than 800 kilometers of canals, using only observation of the land and manual labor. The water flowed by gravity, no pumps, no metal tools. The system worked for centuries and supported thousands of people in a region where it barely rains. When colonizers arrived in the Salt River Valley, they found the canals abandoned and simply started using them, with no idea who had built them. The city of Phoenix literally grew on top of that network. Today, engineers and researchers study the layout of these canals because their water use efficiency rivals modern techniques. A people without writing left behind an engineering work that lasted longer than many European structures from the same era. Number 19. The Oneida fought alongside Washington in the Revolution. They risked everything for a nation that didn't even fully exist yet. While other tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy backed the British, the Oneida chose the colonists. They provided scouts, warriors, and even food when the Continental Army was starving. at Valley Forge. Without them, key moments of the war would have gone differently. In 1794, the government recognized that loyalty with a formal treaty, guaranteeing their lands in New York State forever. It seemed fair, but forever lasted less than 20 years. New York State itself started pressuring the Oneida with fraudulent deals, taking piece after piece of the territory that had been promised. The federal government, which had signed the treaty, stood by and watched. By 1840, the Oneida had lost almost everything, and many were pushed to Wisconsin. The United States' first military alliance with the native people ended in a quiet betrayal. Number 20. At a time when the whole world measured power by accumulated wealth, the Kwakwaka'wakw of the North Pacific did the opposite. Among them, the most respected leader was the one who gave the most away, not the one who kept the most. The potlatch ceremony worked like this. A chief would gather hundreds of people and give out blankets, canoes, food, and even copper objects worth a fortune. The more you gave, the higher your status. Hoarding was seen as weakness. This system worked for centuries until the Canadian government decided to ban it in 1885, labeling the practice an obstacle to civilization. The tribes kept holding potlatches in secret, risking prison to keep the tradition alive. The ban was only lifted in 1951, more than 6 decades later. Number 21. Did you know the U.S. government treated indigenous leaders as national security threats? COINTELPRO, the FBI program, didn't just go after groups like the Black Panthers, it also infiltrated and sabotaged the American Indian movement. During the 1970s, federal agents posed as activists, created internal conflict, and planted false evidence against leaders. The best-known case is Leonard Peltier, convicted in 1977 for the deaths of 2 FBI agents at Pine Ridge. The problem is that the FBI itself later admitted that the evidence used at trial was inconsistent. Even so, Peltier was never released. He's over 80 and is still in prison to this day. Organizations like Amnesty International have called for his release. His case raises a question a lot of people would rather not ask. Did the justice system work here, or was it used as a political tool? Number 22. The case. Johnson versus McIntosh changed everything. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that when Europeans discovered a land, they automatically gained rights over it. It didn't matter that millions of people had already lived there for thousands of years. In practice, the court said that setting foot on an inhabited continent was enough to claim it. That decision created what's called the Doctrine of Discovery, which became the legal basis for removing entire nations from their territories. Tribes lost millions of acres with no agreement, no compensation, and no choice. What's most striking is that this doctrine didn't stay in the past. The Supreme Court cited it again in 2005 in City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation. Nearly 2 centuries later, the same colonial logic is still used to support decisions about indigenous land in the United States. Number 23. For centuries, Native peoples used plants like echinacea and willow to treat illnesses. When pharmaceutical labs isolated compounds from those same plants and filed million-dollar patents, some tribes went to court. The argument was straightforward, that knowledge had belonged to them for generations. But the courts said no. U.S. law protects whoever documents it first in a patent, not whoever used it first. In other words, knowledge passed from grandparent to grandchild for thousands of years doesn't count for anything on paper. But a lab report, made in a few months, can be worth billions. Several indigenous nations tried to change this in Congress, pushing for laws that would recognize traditional intellectual property. To this day, No federal legislation has been passed. The knowledge keeps getting extracted, and the profit keeps going somewhere else. Number 24. Geronimo surrendered in 1886. After years of running through the desert with a handful of warriors, the government promised the imprisonment would be temporary. A lie. He died in 1909, still under military custody at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, without ever setting foot on his homeland again. But what's even more striking is that his people stayed imprisoned after him. Apache men, women, and children were classified as prisoners of war for nearly 3 decades, even though they posed no threat at all. The last group wasn't released until 1914, almost 30 years after the surrender. There was no war going on. No active conflict existed. They were kept locked up simply because the government didn't know what to do with people who had dared to resist. They were the longest-held prisoners of war in American history. Number 25. When the colonizers arrived, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already running with a system that separated powers, allowed leaders to be removed, and guaranteed representation among different nations. And there was one detail Americans would only accept centuries later. Women voted. They were the ones who chose and removed the chiefs. This had been happening since the 15th century. The U.S. only recognized women's voting rights in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Wyoming was the first state to allow it. In 1869, still more than 400 years after the Haudenosaunee. Benjamin Franklin studied this system before the Constitutional Convention. Part of the structure of the American government has direct roots in this indigenous confederacy. But in history books, that credit basically disappeared.